Wyoming has done an exceptional job in terms of firsts, but maybe not so well in terms of seconds. First state to recognize women's inherent right to vote and hold office, first woman governor, first female bailiff, all these great things, and then not so many seconds. We didn't come into the Union without our women, as the quote goes, and suffrage here predated the 19th Amendment by 50 years. Yeah, we're a little behind in a few places, and some of the inequalities that still exist are actually around some of the places where we were really first. Women's representation really lags the national average. Even though in the late 70s and all through the 80s and into the 90s, Wyoming elected more women to the state legislature than most other states. In 1992, there was a change during the redistricting process, which we've just gone through again 20 years later, and it changed from multi-member districts to single-member districts. And in that process, Wyoming's sort of percentage of women in the state legislature dropped precipitously. And we went from one of the best in the country to one of the worst in the country. And that's something that still persists. So about 18% of the state legislature is comprised of women. That's actually also true of mayors and county commissioners and town councilors. It all hovers just under 20%. So that's clearly a place where we've got some work to do. And I would argue that one of the places that that kind of contributes to that is that Wyoming is often among the lowest in terms of ranking for gender wage gap. This year, in the most recent data, Wyoming is 51st. The gap between what women earn and what men earn in this state is the absolute lowest of all 50 states in the District of Columbia. And that's something that ultimately impacts every other aspect in your question. Basically, it's harder to access healthcare if you don't have enough money. It's really difficult to secure childcare if you don't have enough money. If you're one of the women who comprise the 75% of all of our minimum wage workers in the state who are women, it's really difficult to pay for your education or to pay for your healthcare or to run for office. And so it's really a contributing factor to a number of the issues that we have in the state. And again, on healthcare, Wyoming's maternal mortality and morbidity rate is really, really high. And the United States is high overall in the world, especially among industrialized nations. But Wyoming having a high ranking and rural women in particular being really vulnerable, indigenous women being particularly vulnerable. And in Wyoming, that's really true. There is what's called sex-segregated occupations. So there are certain jobs that are really largely comprised of men. Those generally pay really good wages. And then there are certain occupations, in particular healthcare and education. Elder care is in there as well, and childcare, that are almost entirely comprised of women, but don't pay very well. And in fact, 75% of all minimum wage workers in Wyoming are women. And when you're trying to support your family, achieve self-sufficiency, contribute to your community, earning at that low end is incredibly, essentially crippling for a lot of women in the state. And again, that gender wage gap is really a function of men occupying most of the very highly paid jobs and women occupying most of the jobs at the low end of the economic spectrum. And how do you start to acknowledge what women in the state contribute to the state's economy, and how much better off we all are, all of us, when women in the community are empowered and can thrive and can access the same kind of jobs that men can? Because we know in this state that when women have more education, they have more economic opportunities. And when they have more economic opportunities, some of the things that we've been talking about really start to diminish when we start to get access to education in particular. I think that we have kind of mythologized the ethos of, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and rugged individualism. I certainly think that the climate and the size of the state and the isolation of our communities when it snows, or when we have weather events of any kind. They cut us off from each other, and we're already pretty physically distant as it is. That certainly contributes to that sort of mythology that we have. But honestly, we need each other to survive the winter. And so, if you don't have that kind of interdependence, if you can't count on your neighbors, on your community members, it puts us at a huge disadvantage. And so I think there's always such an interesting paradox that we manage in this state between independence and interdependence. And I do think that sort of the size and the climate really contribute. And I think that the Suffragette Symphony and Stephanie Ann Boyd's piece really captured a lot of that, captured what the natural landscape is like, captured how it shapes the people, how it shapes the women in that space, and sort of gives us another lens or framework to think and talk about kind of our geography and how we're connected to each other and what difference that can make for women and communities. So I think that one of the most important, but also maybe the most subtle thing that is happening and that we can continue to do is really change the conversation. Start to highlight the fact that women contribute in particular ways. I think our media is starting to do a really good job of saying, hey, this policy passed in your state legislature and it impacts women, but there were no women on the committee that voted on it. And shift that conversation in meaningful ways is just a really straightforward but very subtle thing that honestly does change how policy gets made. But because of the way our tax structure is, right, the state's revenues run on industry dollars. So of course, industry jobs are the things that we are going to put at the top of any kind of hierarchy as we're thinking about it and talking about it. But we also have a really strong nonprofit sector in the state. It is a huge part of the state's economy, and it is often overlooked. It is driven almost exclusively by women, right? It's more than 75% female. It, again, is a huge component of the state's economy. The nonprofit network puts out great numbers about how many jobs are in that sector, how many dollars are generated by that sector, how much tourism is attracted by the arts sector, for example, where women are genuinely driving that sector, and it is a huge economic boon to the state. It attracts all sorts of, tourism and dollars, spending in communities. I mean, across the state, when the symphony orchestra has an event, other businesses in your community thrive. That's true for all of our arts and event centers across the state. It helps all kinds of businesses and all kinds of industry. But we don't talk about it in quite the same way because it gives us this whole other lens to think and talk about what's happening in our communities, what's happening economically, and then also how to see our state and how to see women in our state. I think Stephanie Ann Boyd is so extraordinary because she's one of a few female composers. She is among the only composers out there writing about themes and topics that address women and how we move through the world or how we impact history, how we impact art. And so I think even just that subtle shift of saying, hey, wait a second, you may not realize that every composer you've been listening to is actually a man. Or maybe you are one of the few symphonies that actually has been presenting more equally distributed composers, but that's really rare. And I think we go and we consume the arts, for example, and don't think about it that way. And just even having that subtle shift and that reframe is so important and so helpful and gives us another tool to kind of move through the world. We all have busy lives. You want to be making a difference in your community, and just subtle, simple shifts in places that you love and care about can make a tremendous difference in how we have the conversation, in how we interact with each other, and how we interact with the arts. So I'm just really appreciative that this piece is out there and that there was the composer to do it, the vision for it, and that it really embodies this state in such an important and very different way. So I would start there in terms of advocacy, that it can be something really simple. There are lots of other ways to get involved for people who have time, but I think if you feel like, gosh, I already have kids and a job and a life and unpaid care work that takes up every minute of my day. Just really thinking about like, hey, I'm pretty excited. I got to go see a piece by a female composer. She's maybe the only female composer I've heard this year. And the focus of that was about women in this state that I live in and love. Boy, that is great advocacy work. Attending meetings, it's really, really boring and really, really important. And one of the silver linings of the pandemic is that it's become a whole lot easier. You can actually sort of tune in on YouTube, and hopefully that will continue, because that sort of participation from everybody across the state has been an incredible thing to watch. I mean, for folks like me who follow policy in the state legislature, it's been extraordinary to watch, ranchers take breaks from chores and essentially Zoom in to give testimony in committee from their truck, or from out in the pasture. I think lots of times people don't realize that, voter changes to the voter rolls or changes to registration policies disproportionately impact women. So if you're in the process of getting married or divorced and you've changed your name in some capacity, making sure that the voter rolls match your ID so that you can cast your vote, it's an incredibly important thing to do, because really, like, your ability to vote is your ability to have a voice in the policy making and the decision making in our state and in your specific community. And so I really think of that as just absolutely a sacred right that we all need to take seriously. And it's a great way for the average person, and especially the average woman, to really have an impact in the community immediately.